multiple answers that are there. How many times did you ever fill out the answer for the client?
Not very often.
So you act, and in the circumstances where you ever fill out the answer for the client?
Not very often.
So you act, and in the circumstances where you filled it out, it was because they were physically unable to do it, right?
Or may have had reading or other comprehension
Right.
problems, yes.
But if the person did not have any reading or comprehension issues, or didn't have their hands cut off, something like a physical disability, there's no...
I would think of it as somehow we are using it for the interview, but we didn't do that. I've not done that very
No,
often.
you. I'm just asking
No.
about you.
I may have done it once or twice, but rarely.
You dropped
I
off.
may have done it once or twice as that. I've not done that very
No,
often.
you. I'm just asking
No.
about you.
I may have done it once or twice, but rarely.
You dropped off.
I may have done it once or twice as part of an interview, so I'm asking the questions
Right.
instead of them, but most often they would fill it out.
Right, which is what we just talked about, that this could be done like in an interview, right? We start
Part of an
Sure.
interview, so I'm asking the questions
Right.
instead of them, but most often they would fill it out.
Right, which is what we just talked about, that this could be done like in an interview, right? We started out talking about this, and that's what I asked you about, and you said, yes, that's exactly what we're talking
correct.
about. And what you're saying is, in this particular case, that to you, let's assume the person was untruthful as to the traumatic event. And let's assume there is no traumatic event. Assume that it doesn't exist. And yet they fill out all of the answers here. Your answer to that was, it's still valid to you, right?
I don't think I answered that question.
Well, then answer
before.
it.
I misunderstood. If I know there's no traumatic event, first, I wouldn't be giving it. Second is, then if there's no traumatic event, well, yeah, I don't know what the reason would be to give it. But if somebody somehow had no traumatic event and they did fill this out and you got these results, I'd need to go back and explore why they're responding the way they did.
And this is, again, could be just like sitting down and talking to the client, right? In other words,
yes.
This could be conducted with an individual and just asking the questions, and you could write the answers, right?
Yes, sir.
It's because there are no validity scales, right?
Yes, sir.
And assuming that you were conducting this interview and you were talking to this person and this person was untruthful to you during that interview, wouldn't that raise a red flag to you? If you're sitting down and talking to an individual, wouldn't that at least raise a red flag to you?
Objection beyond scope.
Overruled.
Yes.
Sir, one of the other things that you talked about, let me show you some exhibits. Take a look at exhibits numbers 654 and 653. If you just look at them yourself.
Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with those photographs?
No, sir.
I thought you just testified and told us about Dr. Horn having, in your opinion, not being accurate with regard to Mr. Alexander and whether or not he received a injury to the frontal lobe.
You're asking two questions. You asked me about
Well, I'm
the
asking you,
medical-
are you familiar with that, first of all? Yes or no?
These pictures?
You're
No.
right.
No,
Have
sir.
you ever seen them before?
I don't believe so.
And those photographs that you are looking at, they generally depict the inside of an individual's skull, right?
Yes, sir.
They also have some arrows there, right?
Yes, sir.
Do you know what those arrows mean?
No, not without the report or explanation.
And in fact, those arrows point to...
Objection, hearsay, testimony.
Overruled.
No, not without the report or explanation.
And in fact, those arrows point to...
Objection, hearsay, testimony.
Overruled. Don't they point to that skull? Yes or no?
They point to inside
Don't hold
the
them up.
skull.
Just look at them yourself.
Yes, they point inside the skull.
In your experience, sir, given your experience as a neuropsychologist, can you tell us the trajectory of the bullet based on those photographs? That
Objection beyond the scope. Beyond expertise.
overruled.
No, not likely without more explanations.
Well, no, but you couldn't do it, right?
No,
You would go to an expert, wouldn't you?
or I'd read the medical examination report.
You have read the medical examiner's report in this case, haven't you?
Yes, sir.
If I tell you that this is Mr. Alexander's skull opened up, can you tell me the trajectory just by looking at that?
No, I would rely on what the report said, not on those particular photos. I would go, if I wanted to know the trajectory then I would read what the examiner said was the trajectory, and I would trust that that was accurate.
So what you're saying then is that you are only here to tell us what you read in a report, right?
Well, two things.
Yes or no? Are you here to tell us something else?
Yes.
But that knowledge that you have, or what you're here to tell us, is based solely on what's on that police report, right?
You mean medical examiner?
I'm sorry, the medical examiner's report, right?
No, because part of it is based completely on that. The other part was talking about the brain itself, not based on a report. It was talking about how the brain functions. So there's two different things I did.
But that's your experience, though. That's what you carry with you everywhere you go, right?
Yes, sir.
And the only new thing that's added here is the report, right?
Yes, sir.
And so you're telling us that what your opinion as a neuropsychologist is based on a reading of a report, correct?
And my knowledge of the brain.
And your knowledge of the brain, and you've indicated that if you really wanted more explanation as to this particular issue, you would go to an expert yourself, wouldn't you?
Yes, sir.
I don't have anything else, thank you.
Redirect.
You got me with a question.
You may. We're going to take a 10-minute recess. So again, it's 4:20 now according to this clock, so it will be 4:30 according to this clock. Adjust your timepieces accordingly. Please remember the admonition. You are excused.
Please stand for the jury.
That's fine.
when he's done, you could have that.
Record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. You may continue with redirect, or begin redirect.
Thank you, Judge. Okay, you ready?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. You were asked questions about an O'Rourke case, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And in that case, the judge had not so nice things to say about you.
That is correct.
And in fact, one of the things he said that you were a hired gun.
Yes, ma'am.
And is that somebody who comes in and testifies to what they're being paid to testify for, so to speak?
Yes, that's the general definition.
And is that a type of person who will ignore certain testing results and still come up with their own diagnosis to fit what is wanted from them?
Judge, I like the foundation.
Is that how you would define it?
Yes, that would be one of the ways it could be exhibited.
Okay. Now, I'd like to hear the rest of the story with regard to what happened in that case. Is there something that happened with regard to that judge and all the parties in that case?
Yes.
Can you tell us?
That was a child custody case with a battered woman and at least 2 kids that we dealt with. We actually evaluated the woman and the 2 children based on a whole battery of tests and interviews and records. It became clear through Child Protective Services and others that the kids had been abused, and so had the woman. So I had testified about our evaluation, or tried to, and also testified as to some major flaws in the quote experts who had done the report to the court. These were people who were appointed by that judge and had worked pretty frequently with that judge.
And you were criticizing these people?
Yes.
Okay.
I was indicating in very specific ways how they had obviously misinterpreted tests, used, in this case, neuropsychological tests to deal with parenting, which is inappropriate, and came in to basically also talk about what we had found in the children we had tested and I had talked to myself, who did not want to live with the father. After I testified, and as counsel pointed out, I didn't see the opinion for quite some time because I had testified much earlier. But 2 things happened. One is, it's the only...
You're saying relevance?
Sustained.
May we approach? With regard to this case, were there problems with, did people complain about the way the judge handled this case?
Yes.
What happened?
After that decision,
Sustained.
Well, just briefly, what happened? After this case ended, did the judge treat the other parties of the case rudely or inappropriately?
Objection.
Overruled, you may answer yes or no.
the other parties meaning,
Objection on the scope of your instruction.
I just didn't, I needed to hear the question.
People involved in the case. Were
Yes.
there problems with the way the judge treated people involved in this case?
Yes,
And did people complain about that?
yes,
And ultimately, after this case, did that judge resign?
yes.
Thank you. All right, so next let's talk about the Clark case. Okay? Oh, you
Yes.
were asked questions about the Clark case, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And that has to do with where you gave an affidavit,
Yes,
and in that affidavit, that was something that you included in that affidavit, your limited scope of what you were writing about.
yes, I stated what the limitations and what I was basing it on.
Okay, and basically there was no question about your honesty in the affidavit, was there?
No, sir. No, ma'am.
And so, but the problem is that you didn't have the time. Did you have the time to review all the information to be able to have a more comprehensive affidavit submitted to the court?
No. It was a short time where they asked for it. I said I could only do X amount because I wouldn't have had the time. They said do it anyway. I did. I explained in the affidavit what the limitations were, what I reviewed, what I did not. And then the ruling that was read was based on, because I stated I did not have the time, and the court ruled that, yes, this was not complete, it was based on hearsay, wasn't comprehensive, and therefore they weren't going to allow it. Nothing about me or my credentials or my integrity.
Okay, so there was no issues with your actual your integrity with regard to this case, right?
No, that is correct.
Okay, and there was a French case you were asked about, right?
Well, the name was French.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes,
Yes, the name was French, not speaking French.
correct.
Okay, and what happened with regard to this case? We understand that your testimony was excluded, right?
No, this was a kidnapping case. It was also a woman and children who had been abused. I wasn't involved. She had taken her child and fled and was arrested later. This was the kidnapping case. And I was asked to explain about the dynamics of domestic violence, the dynamics of child abuse. The judge did not allow me to testify legally is what's called the ultimate question. I was asked that, and then the judge said, no, you can't answer that part of it. But I testified for a full day, all of which was accepted and utilized. And in fact, the appellate court indicated that my credentials...
Sustained.
Oh, okay.
So in other words, you were allowed to testify about everything you knew with regard to your expertise?
Yes,
Okay. And the judge made a legal decision to not let you testify about one particular area, right?
that's correct.
And did the judge say with that one particular area that that's up for the jury to decide?
Exactly.
And that's why you were not allowed to testify?
Yes.
And it had nothing to do with your credentials, did it?
No, in fact.
And in fact, did the court say that you had great credentials?
Yes, and stated in the opinion.
Overall.
Credibility. So,
Yes.
I'm sorry, yes? they
Yes, the
did say-
judge actually stated,
Beyond scope of the question.
Sustained.
The question was, did the court actually note that you had excellent credentials?
yes, they stated
Objection
that.
beyond scope of the question, yes or no?
Yes,
Yes, how?
they actually,
Relevance.
the court actually indicated and put in the record the correct,
Judge, this is follow-up, it's follow-up to he opened the door.
Approach, please.
So Dr. Geffner, even though you weren't allowed to testify because of a legal issue, did the court ultimately state that you have excellent credentials with regard to your expertise?
well, he did say I wasn't allowed to testify,
Objection.
couldn't testify about.
Objection beyond the scope of the question, yes or no?
What did he say?
Objection, hearsay.
Sustained.
Okay, so, simple question.
Yes,
With
ma'am.
regard to this particular case, okay, on cross-examination, Mr. Martinez made it sound as though your testimony was excluded because you did something bad, okay?
Yes, ma'am.
So let's assume that's the way it made it sound. He made it sound. What I'm asking is, we've talked about the fact that what you were not allowed to testify was a minor part that was a legal conclusion that the judge said that's not something an expert can do. Is that right?
Yes,
Okay. And did the judge allow you to testify for a day about all the other things that you have an expertise?
yes,
And in fact, in the opinion, did the court actually talk about the fact that you have excellent credentials?
yes.
Okay. Thank you. With regard to questions about getting paid, that you get a salary, you remember being asked those questions?
Yes,
And there is money that is getting paid to the institute, right?
hopefully,
Okay, hopefully. And this is a nonprofit institute?
yes,
And so that money is given to the institute and goes into its budget, is that right?
yes,
And you don't personally see any of that money?
that's correct.
Okay. With regard to, you were asked questions about Gatchell, Dr. Gatchell,
Yes, ma'am.
and some studies that were done that Dr. Gatchell eventually had a study that talked about the MMPI and the floating profiles. Do you remember
Yes,
that?
yes.
All right. May I approach, Judge? Yes. Showing you exhibit number 649. Is that the study that you were asked questions about?
Yes,
Okay, and in this study, what is your opinion as to what this study says?
that they are not dealing with a floating profile anymore. The term, in fact, he says in the first line, formerly known as, and now they've switched gears based on the research that had come out, and what was now known in the field. And what he was focusing on was this profile being defined as a disability profile. It's the term he used, in order to now be used for dealing with a pain population, no longer dealing with clients or trauma or borderline or anything. They were really focused on pain patients and whether this had a relationship to it.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, then what used to be termed as a floating profile, in Gatchell's own article, he now says, we're not calling it that anymore, we're going to call it a disability profile. Is that one thing?
Yes, because
Okay.
the research had now come out by this time and started being very clear that there was no such predictive factor and it shouldn't be used that way. And as a good researcher, he then modified and revised because it was clear that that was inappropriate.
Okay, and part of what was inappropriate is then he wanted to now label this a disability profile, and does he link it then to people having to do with chronic pain?
Yes.
Okay, he doesn't link it anymore to people with borderline.
Well, not unless they were associated with chronic pain. It was specifically focused on that population.
Okay, all right. All right, you were asked questions about an article, Impact of Simulating Borderline Personality Disorder on the MMPI-2. It's exhibit number 650. May I approach? And I believe the prosecutor asked you to read a certain paragraph.
Yes, he did.
Okay, so do you have an understanding of what that article is reflective of?
Yes, it was basically, oh, yes.
Yes, okay, what is it?
It was basically looking at how people might do on the MMPI if they pretended they had borderline and those characteristics, and what scales would be elevated, et cetera, with that type of situation.
Okay, and so does that article then tend to suggest that MMPI can diagnose borderline?
No.
What does it say about that?
Again, it's not talking about diagnosing borderline based on this. It's talking about associations. There's an important difference in science and psychology about things associated with one thing versus being able to predict something. That's a major difference. When you use a test to diagnose, you're essentially predicting. There's lots of things that are associated with each other. Borderline personality happens to be strongly associated with PTSD. But you can't say that borderline predicts PTSD. So a lot of these studies are looking at, well, what are associated with each other, not to use a test to predict. And this particular article that I was not familiar with until he showed it to me, actually looks at what the profile is, and in order to fit this article, you have to have specific criteria met. That's what they say that he did not have me read. The case we were having up there did not meet it. If you had the MMPI, I can show you.
Are you talking about the validity and clinical scales?
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm showing you exhibit number 631.
So we were talking before about, because he was talking about it being elevated. Well, this particular article itself that actually says that in order to be found this way, you would have to have a cutoff score on the F scale. This is the F right here. You can see that score right here, well, if you went up just a bit, is 79 right here. This article says to be considered in their connection to borderline personality, this score would need to be at a minimum cutoff of 96. So instead of 79, it would be up here. And it also said that the FP scale, which is this one right here, which her score, oh, I didn't mean to cover it. Her score is, no, FP? Yes, would also need to be elevated, and hers is not elevated at all, as you can see. But in this particular study, you would have to have this scale also elevated up here. So you would end up having a profile that looked something like this, way up there, which isn't relevant to this case at all because we don't even have that. So this whole issue, again, of trying to establish an association with borderline is interesting research, but it doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about. It's not using this test to predict it, and it's really misleading based on, I wasn't allowed to actually say where those scores were.
All right. With regard to these multiple elevations that we see on the MMPI,
Yes.
does that cause you concern that of malingering?
Well, it does, not necessarily these. You come over here to the validity scales. If these were all down, like here, the main validity scales are this F scale, the L scale, the K scale, and you can even use, if you want, this S scale. This scale up here, the F, is in the clinical range. Then that means you need to be cautious. It doesn't say why. I mean, yes, it could be malingering, it could be exaggeration, it could be a lot of things. This elevation here means symptoms severity. It indicates that we're getting a lot of symptoms. Now, the interpretation of these scales, if done correctly, is that, yes, the reason we have all these in here is because we got a lot of symptoms. What might be causing that? Well, the person could be exaggerating. That was the whole argument with malingering or secondary gain. However, the normal, even unless you have evidence of malingering, the more common interpretation is a cry for help, somebody in severe distress. And this is, they may be exaggerating some of the symptoms, but it's really talk about such major distress as a cry for help. But again, those would all be working hypotheses that you would want to then talk to the person about, look at the other tests. You wouldn't rely on one test.
Okay.
Theoretically, you shouldn't. Maybe I should say it that way.
Okay. All right, and on this we see the schizophrenia scale
Yes.
is elevated, right?
Yes.
Okay. Can you, and then in the back of this MMPI, do they have the actual subscales?
Yes, they do.
Okay. So, I'm looking at page 8. Does that give us the subscales for schizophrenia?
Yes, so one of the things they do, you can see up here it says Harris Lingo. This research takes those clinical scales and then breaks it into sub-things to help you understand more why that scale is elevated. So, as the example you just asked me, the schizophrenia, which is down here, now you look over here at the T-scores and you see, does that help you understand more? I mean, is this person really psychotic? Which would be, some of these other scales. But you look here and you see this person is really alienated toward themselves and others. That's the highest. They have no ego mastery. I don't know if you can actually, hopefully you can see that. Those are the two really extreme things that are pulling this scale up. So it's not somebody who's actually psychotic or schizophrenic in the true sense of the word. It's somebody who is having major issues with their own ego, feelings about themselves, and a lot of alienation, emotional alienation. So you can actually go through these different scales and look at that, which would be appropriate to try to narrow down again, like we did with the other tests, why is these scales so elevated? She had so many scales elevated, and there's a whole bunch of things going on that you would need to explore in more detail.
Okay. If you were trying to diagnose, would you want to explore these scales in more detail?
That would be required, to use that word which I didn't like before, is in order to actually diagnose, you are required to do these other things.
So in order to diagnose somebody then, you would have to use the scales beyond just page 2 validity and the clinical scales, right?
And other tests and interviews and records, etc.
Okay. You were asked about the scales. Here, HY and PD. What are those again?
HY is hysteria. PD, the term is psychopathic deviant. It's not a good term. It's actually the psychopathic deviant and the schizophrenia. You know, if it wasn't that way historically, they would probably relabel those because it gives the people the wrong impression.
Okay.
This is more of a impulsivity, sometimes anti-authority scale. Doesn't really mean the person is either a deviant or psychopathic. That's why, unfortunately, the label is not good, but that's the technical term.
Okay. You were asked questions about whether or not these two scales were elevated. Do you remember that?
Oh, yes.
And then asked questions about whether or not, yes or no, if they indicated borderline personality. And you said you couldn't answer that as a yes or no. Why is that?
Because, again, this test isn't designed to assess borderline personality. That's a different question than saying, could somebody with borderline personality end up with this profile? Yes, they could. But can you use this profile to reverse and say this person, because of this, has borderline personality disorder? No, it's not appropriate. I can probably design lots of different profiles that somebody with borderline or PTSD or some other diagnosis could end up, because that's not the way this test is to be used.
Okay. And in fact, is there a better test to diagnose borderline?
Well, that was what we talked about. The Milan, the MCMI, is designed specifically for that. So if you had a working hypothesis like we did this morning, you would look at the results of that test, and if the borderline is elevated, then you would then have a working hypothesis that, ooh, borderline might be the appropriate diagnosis.
Okay. And when we looked at the results of the MCMI, borderline was not elevated, was it?
It wasn't even close.
It wasn't even close. Okay. You were asked questions about the TSI
Yes, ma'am?
and whether or not you knew who created the TSI.
Yes, ma'am?
Dr. Briere?
Yes.
Do you know Dr. Briere?
Oh, yes.
Okay. And have you worked with him with regard to creating the TSI or testing for it?
Yes, when he originally, I've known him for a long time, and when he was originally designing this test, as I mentioned, we were one of the test sites for them and for him. Before it ever got published, we were communicating and we were evaluating the test. As I said, he's at the University of Southern California. I probably have known him for 25 years now.
All right. With regard to the TSI, there was this conversation went back and forth about instructions versus mandatory to do the summary scales.
Yes.
When you have given the TSI, do you do the summary scales?
Yes.
Why would you do the summary scales?
Because it gives you the complete use and picture of that test. I mean, it's like, why wouldn't you? Can you tell from the other scales if you're likely to have an overall trauma score elevated? Sure. But it's not just my guess or my experience. That's objective. That's not me. That's a computer scoring this based on the research. And yes, in fact, that scale indicates that trauma itself as an overall entity, besides all the individual things, is a significant issue, clinical, and the other things. So you can have different scales elevated there that wouldn't necessarily show you that the trauma scale itself, overall trauma, like PTSD, was in the clinical range. That's what it does. It's not just an add-on. It's a key part of the overall interpretation of the test.
And I'm showing you Exhibit 646. So we see the summary scales on the right.
Yes. So there's no real reason not to do it. It's like saying, okay, I'm going to exclude this part of the test because I'm not interested in it, or, you know, what the heck. No test is going to tell you you're required to do it. They will tell you how you're required to administer it. They assume you're trained in using this. That's part of the ethical requirements. And they're assuming you know how to score and interpret it. And they're telling you how to score it. I mean, it's almost like redundant to say, by the way, you need to do this, this, and this. We're supposed to know that.
Okay. And so part of the instructions is to tell you how to do conduct the test appropriately. Is that right?
Yeah, and then it does tell you, if you're not going to computer score it, the scoring manual tells you how to compute those summary scales manually if you were going to score the whole test manually.
Okay. Okay, you were asked questions about this printout from a website. May I approach, Judge? Exhibit 652.
Yes,
Does that
ma'am.
appear to be a printout from a website?
It's likely a copy of website transferred into another website.
Okay, at the top of that page, what do you see? Whose name is it?
John Briere, PhD.
Okay, and then the rest of that, can you tell who that comes from? Who
Yes.
writes the rest of it?
Yes.
Who writes it?
That's the test publisher. That's right out of the test publisher's website. What they do to promote and advertise the test and tell you what's in it. It gives you the scales. It's talking about some of the research, which is what he was having me read, but it wasn't having me explain the whole thing. This is not from John Briere. This is from the test publisher, and it's talking about different studies that have been done using this. And then there's like 4 pages, 5, 6 pages of articles by people all over the country who have tested out or used this instrument in research and others, not just Dr. Briere. So this one thing he highlighted was talking about one particular study that the publisher highlighted, and I'm not even clear that Dr. Briere is the one who did that particular study. He tends not to work a lot with inpatients, and that's what that was about. But somebody evidently did a study that showed there's an association. But you can't say this is from Dr. Briere and that he's contradicting me or I'm contradicting him. There's, I mean, one, just to be accurate, 2, 3, 4. There are 4.5 pages of articles about the TSI that people basically all over the country and in other countries have done at the time this was produced. And I don't remember which, I don't know how old this is, because obviously this isn't current, because the current one would have the TSI-2. So this is even an old version of looking at this. And I was trying to see if there's actually a date. No, I can't find a date on it. But this is obviously prior to the last few years that somebody pulled up, because everything now the publisher and Dr. Briere would have would be the TSI-2.
Okay, and is there a difference between association and diagnosing?
Yes, it's a large difference.
So, to be clear, with the TSI, is that an instrument used to diagnose borderline?
No, it is not.
Can a person with borderline traits or borderline characteristics have elevations on the TSI,
Yes, definitely.
And do borderline characteristics, is there an overlap between borderline characteristics and PTSD characteristics?
Yeah, actually there's quite a large overlap because we know from years of research that borderline personality often comes out, or the characteristics, with PTSD. That's why I said this morning, if you have all these criteria for borderline, but it's all in conjunction with, at the same time, or after the trauma, you don't diagnose the personality, you only diagnose the trauma. You would have to have those traits prior to the trauma as well, and then you wouldn't eliminate the trauma, you would diagnose both.
Okay. You were asked questions about the medical examiner's report, right?
Yes, ma'am?
And you are relying on what the medical examiner says in his own report, right?
Definitely.
And you're not trying to say that you are a medical examiner or a medical doctor, right?
Both of those are correct. I'm not trying to say either.
Okay. But in your expertise with neuropsychology, do you understand how the brain works?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you understand brain injuries?
Yes, ma'am.
And if in this report you were asked questions about the word apparent.
Yes.
Okay. Prior to seeing that, though, don't we see that Dr. Horn actually writes when he's talking about the brain that it is without gross evidence of significant intracranial hemorrhage?
Yes.
And then he says, or apparent cerebral injury, right?
Yes.
Okay. Regardless of whether or not you can examine a brain because it's decomposed or not, or anything like that, in Dr. Horn's own report, does he say that this membrane, the duramater, is intact?
Yes.
Is there any possible way for the duramater to remain intact if something pierced through it into the brain?
Not that I'm aware of.
And so you're relying on the fact that Dr. Horn wrote a valid report, right?
Yes, I'm assuming all the information are accurate because I would have no way of knowing otherwise.
Okay. Okay, you were asked questions about the PDS test, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you were asked questions about secondary gain, if a person has a reason to lie on the PDS test to make their symptoms seem worse than they are, right?
Yes.
And if a person were to lie on this and exaggerate their symptoms, at the end of this test, there is a symptom severity score, isn't there?
Yes, there is.
And I'm showing Exhibit 535. Stapled. Okay, the symptom severity score, you see that right there?
Yes, actually, it's right in the area of the arrow, more or
Oh,
less.
sorry.
Yes.
Okay, symptoms, and we see the number is 33, is that right?
Yes,
Okay, what's the maximum?
51.
So if somebody were to be exaggerating their symptoms, would you expect to see this number higher then?
Objection, microphone.
Overruled.
Yes, if somebody's really trying to make themselves look bad or fake or malinger, then they tend to really escalate all the symptoms. That's assuming, again, they don't know how specifically to take a test. But yes, you usually see then an extreme elevation in those cases.
Okay. And with regard to the medical examiner, again, you're not, the trajectory of the bullet, you're relying on what's in his report, right?
Yes. Well, and knowing what he said is where the bullet ended up and where it went in, and knowing the brain.
Okay, so based on what you know about the brain and what Dr. Horn says in his own report, can you tell us and give us an idea of where the bullet went?
Yes.
Okay, what is that?
It looks like it went in on it, as I said it, or as he said, a downward angle in the forehead and ended up behind the cheek. Actually, he tells you how many inches from the nose and back behind the cheek, and it went through the nasal cavity. It's what he said, which is essentially either bypassing the brain or maybe going in part of the frontal lobe. But again, if it's going in the frontal lobe, it should have gone through the dura mater. So, but the trajectory is going down and ending up here and going in here. So that's really not going through major parts of the brain. And I mean, I don't want to say it that way. All parts of the brain are major and important, but it's, if anything, it's going through part of the frontal lobe, and I'm not sure exactly how, then again, with the dura mater intact, but that's essentially what he's saying.
Okay, and so based on what Dr. Horn actually says in his own report, is it possible that the bullet didn't even go through the brain?
It is possible.
And you talked about the sinus cavity?
Yes.
And does that tell you then where the bullet is going, behind the eye, over the mouth?
And behind
or
the
sinus,
nose.
And behind the nose. And that's not near the brain?
Well, it's in front of.
In front of the brain, okay. That plus the fact that the dura mater was intact at the time that Dr. Horn examined, does that also give you a conclusion, or are you able to make a conclusion about the brain because of that?
Objection, asked and answered.
Sustained.
And with regard to the brain, if it did go through a part of the brain, somehow that Dr. Horn's report is incorrect about the dura mater, then it would be through the right frontal lobe, is that right?
Yes.
And based on your experience and knowledge with regard to the brain, does that cause any type of problems that would make the person immediately incapacitated?
No.
And is that based on just your experience with the previous patients you've had, or?
No.
Okay, what is that? What can you give us that answer based on?
There are books written on what's called neuropathology. There are both medical, legal, and neuropsychology books. There are research articles quite a bit actually done in Europe that actually have traced brain projectors in the brain. They've actually studied with cases, people have had different types of injuries to the brain from bullets and others, and what did and what did not incapacitate. They've actually laid out pretty clear criteria of the types of injuries you would need to incapacitate somebody.
And based on those studies, a 25 caliber bullet going through the right frontal lobe, can you tell us anything about whether or not that would cause immediate incapacitation?
Well, depending on, if it went into the brain, it would have to, well, no. Actually, a bullet, especially going through the frontal lobe here, in order to cause incapacitation, would have to essentially go through the motor strip that we showed on the diagram, which is back here, on the right side, which would then incapacitate the left side of the body. Somehow turn and go through and cause damage to the left side, which would then incapacitate the right side, and then somehow end up in the cheek. It's almost like a U-turn. And you'd have to see usually damage too, but you'd have to somehow impact the motor strip area or the brainstem or something to incapacitate a person, especially immediately.
Okay, and that motor strip, is that located in the frontal lobe at all?
No, not at all. Well, it's frontal parietal. It's at the back of the frontal and in sort of the center in the parietal area.
Okay, but is it located anywhere near where you can tell, based on the ME's report, where the bullet went in?
No, it is not.
All right, thank you. Nothing further, Judge.
All right. Dr. Gepner, the jurors have some questions for you.
Yes, ma'am.
How do you feel events such as incarceration, public accusation, and invasion of privacy on a large scale can affect tests such as the MMPI or MCMI?
Well, for the MMPI, it can increase paranoia because it's not only that you think people are out to get you, they are. And so your paranoia scale can go up. If you're having depression, your depression scale can get elevated. Anxiety, if you're worried about the future, all those scales can be elevated on the MMPI. You usually don't see those elevated on the MCMI because that's supposed to be long-standing. It's like personality traits, something that's there back in history. So you don't usually see too much of a change. Where you would see it possibly on the MCMI might be those bottom scales like anxiety or trauma. If somebody is being traumatized by being incarcerated, which definitely can happen, then you could see an elevation in those scales.
Is it possible that an individual could score very differently after a traumatic event, such as killing another person, as opposed to prior to the event?
Yes. God. It depends on what test you're looking at. If you're looking at the trauma inventories, then obviously if you're talking about would the test be different before and after the traumatic incident, whatever it is, yes, definitely, because they theoretically wouldn't have been exposed to trauma beforehand. If you're talking about personality tests and others, then yes, they can be impacted too, because if that changes your personality, like let's say you're not really depressed before this incident, and then now afterwards, for whatever reason, you're severely depressed, that scale can go up. So yes, your scales can vary depending on pretty significant events going on in your life or in your environment.
Please discuss the high and low scales on the validity side of page 2 on the MMPI test.
Are we allowed to put it back up to do that?
Yes.
Okay. We did some of that already, but I'll go over it again. So the normal range down here, so these are actually just telling you whether the person is consistent in their responses, and it's saying the person basically is. And this scale, the FP, is indicating whether the person has any kind of psychotic. In other words, are they answering the question similar to the way somebody who might be psychotic or out of touch with reality might? And it's saying no. So, and then the L scale is actually termed the lie scale. Is somebody really answering these questions in a way that's distorting their answers? And it's saying no. K is defensive. Are they afraid to disclose anything going on? Again, no. S is a little bit in the lower average range. It has more to do with whether the person feels superior, has good self-image, and this is saying this person is definitely in the average to low average. So your elevated scales are these. Over here, the F is the one we mentioned, which is the one that could be exaggerating symptoms or under severe distress or a cry for help. You don't know. It could be any of those. FB is just looking at those same questions on the second half of the test. So it's basically saying, does this person answering the first, remember this is 506, well you don't necessarily remember, but it's 567 questions, so it's a lot. So this is looking at consistency. Are they giving you roughly the same type of responses at the beginning of the half of the test to the second half? And this one, this FBS, which is the highest, is symptom severity. It's indicating that this person is displaying or exhibiting or expressing lots of symptoms.
You stated it is not appropriate to use an old test if a new version has come out. Is it like that for everything? For example, Dr. Samuel stated he did not purchase the new DSM and was using information based on the old version. Does this cause any concern?
Well, DSM is not a test. It's like a diagnostic manual. It's the things we use to make diagnoses. So it's giving you the criteria. So if I think somebody has PTSD, for example, then it tells you what has to happen, what behaviors, what symptoms to diagnose PTSD. It's like a guide for all mental health professionals on how you come up with a diagnosis, whether it's borderline or PTSD or anxiety or depression. So it doesn't affect testing. It's not the same. If you're diagnosing based on an outdated version, that's not really the best idea, especially if things have changed. It's going to become more complicated because next month a DSM-5 is coming out. So all of us are going to have to learn some changes, and there are some changes in the diagnostic code. So there's a time period, though, where we're allowed to get trained and learn. But if it's way in the past, it's not considered the same as a test, but it's not the best idea. It's not a good thing.
Do you know how many questions were changed on the TSI-2 compared to the TSI-1?
Oh, good question. There are, I believe, 20 more questions that were added, and I think, 20 completely, no, that's not right. Let me rephrase. I think there's like 26 questions that are either new or rewritten, 6 that were either rewritten or taken out. So I believe the new version now is 120 questions. So there were some changes. It's not like a major overhaul, but it was reasonably significant.
Are you saying that the PDS survey can be viewed as valid even if the client misstates what the trauma was and or who perpetrated the trauma?
Well, valid, we've already said that there's no validity scale, so that's hard to use that term because it's pretty specific in our profession. There's two different things. If they, as the prosecutor was saying, if they lied about what the event is, then yes, that's important. If they, even lying, end up filling this out indicating PTSD, then what is going on? I mean, that's what I would ask is, what, if this didn't do it and they made that up, is there something else that did cause? Because now I'm getting results that are indicating this person has PTSD. Well, where is it coming from? So, and I think the analogy was a bear or a tiger or something. So if that didn't happen, did something else happen that either they didn't want to admit, didn't want to state, or may not have tuned into? But I would at least be up to me to find out why is this occurring? Why does this person show with PTSD? And I don't know the answer, but that would be up to what the evaluator should find out. You can't just say, okay, they made this up, so I'm ignoring everything else. You still got to figure out why they're saying they have these symptoms. And do they know enough, and that was the issue that was raised, to fake it. Not only to fake it, but to be consistent on others. That's why you don't use one test. You look at a variety of tests to look for consistency. And then it's up to the evaluator to try to put these pieces together to come up with the right picture. Not always easy.
You stated that a lack of apparent hemorrhage from the gunshot wound to the brain indicates lack of significant injury to the brain. Can it also mean it occurred after death, therefore no active bleeding?
I don't know how, can the hemorrhage, can you read that last part again?
Can it also mean it occurred after death, therefore no active bleeding?
I'm going to have to assume that means the gunshot occurred after death.
Yes.
Depends on how far after, because there's still blood in the brain and in the body, so you may not get as much hemorrhaging, but even after death, if something is going through tissue, then it's leaving a path or destroying tissue or something. You just may not have lots of hemorrhaging, but there's usually some type of damage, whether it's before or after, unless it's so far after that essentially there's no blood left in the brain, then you wouldn't see hemorrhaging, but you would still likely see damage.
Is it your belief that a gunshot to the front of the head, specifically the brain, at a very short distance would not be able to immediately drop a person?
To the front side, depends on the caliber. I mean, some of those studies I mentioned, they had shotguns or large caliber guns that essentially went in and just really wiped out the brain. Those cases did incapacitate. But even with large caliber or shotguns that were at a distance, it didn't incapacitate. So it really, to incapacitate, more of those go through the side, because then they go through both the motor strips, and that's what incapacitates. Assuming, again, we haven't hit the spinal cord or the brainstem back here, which is a separate issue, because that will do it. But just the brain itself, something coming in, it would have to be a pretty major damage in the brain that would spread to the motor strips to incapacitate somebody. Again, using the incapacitate meaning couldn't move arms or legs.
You told us that you are not receiving any compensation for this case. Are any of the organizations that you are associated with receiving any financial compensation or consideration from this case?
The Institute on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma, or the Family Violence and Sexual Assault Institute, that bills out for our services. Our general rate is $250 an hour, but we have sliding scales because we're nonprofit. So in this particular case, we started working in November. Then we worked for a few months, and then we didn't do anything. So we also bill out differently. Because we have a whole team, including, I mentioned, interns and postdocs, we bill out for them at like $85 an hour, 1/3 of the rate. But we still do have a sliding scale. So in all the work we've done in this case, which myself and others, which is probably 70, 80 hours, including the trip here today, I think the final bill would probably end up being somewhere around $13,000, $14,000. And that money goes back into the Institute, not in a particular for a particular service. It goes back in the Institute that helps fund all the different things we do, along with everything else we do. This is a small part of our operation. The clinical and forensic services is probably only about 20% of our budget with all the other things we do.
When testing tests or renorming, are there attempts to manipulate or lie on the tests to see if it is possible to direct the outcome of those tests? Please explain.
Yes, in fact, one of the studies that the prosecutor was handing me and talking about was a particular study getting people to pretend they have a disorder. Like that particular one was borderline. There's others that say, pretend you have these symptoms or malinger. Part of these validity scales here are created from research and looked at with people who try to fake it and see if the test picks it up. And it's revised based on the ability to detect those people and distinguish those people from others. So that is always ongoing. That's why these validity scales on all these tests are so important, because it gives you more confidence as a psychologist or clinician that the results are correct.
Do you feel it is possible to manipulate the MMPI, MCMI, PDS, or TSI? Please explain.
Well, I got to answer that in two ways. Manipulating one test as opposed to 4 or 5 tests is a different story. So with my knowledge of psychology in these tests, I could probably manipulate it to come out a certain way because I've been using these for so many years. Or somebody who has the training that I do. Assuming we don't, then unfortunately you can go on the internet now and they'll tell you some things about the MMPI, or I don't know if they have the TSI on there. I haven't seen that one. But there are tests where people tell other people how to fake it, or try to. But the reason to give a whole battery of tests is imagine what you, if you're trying to fake it, and do it in a way that doesn't show up as faking, would have to do to end up answering, say, 800 or 900 questions over several hours. Or if you're given a test now in 6 months or a year or two, remembering, if you're faking it, what you said before to get you the same profile. That's really unlikely. But that is the reason you don't just give one test, because it is easier to malinger or fake one test than a whole battery. That's why if one test indicates something and the others don't, you don't put as much weight in it. You don't go crazy over that one. When you get a consistent pattern, that really reduces the likelihood of somebody either faking it or something that's not real. That means you have to pay attention to it. Or, I'll rephrase it, you should pay attention to it if you're doing an appropriate professional job.
If Dr. DeMarte had additional evidence, such as interviews, journal entries, etc., to support her opinion of borderline personality disorder, would you expect to see that in her report?
Yes.
Did she include that information in her report?
She included a little bit. She included some of the things that she indicated that she found in her interviews or records that she indicated would support borderline. In her report, most of these had to do with things after the incident. I shouldn't say that. After the interaction with Mr. Alexander. So there's a lot of things she quoted in there. And again, I don't know. I don't know if they're accurate, not accurate. I don't know what people actually said or testified. But based on her report, she indicated some of the things that she said supported borderline. If they indeed are accurate and they could be shown to go back, and not just one or two. In other words, borderline actually has like 9 criteria, and you have to meet 5 of it. But you can't meet one of it when you're 14, and one of it when you're 25, and 3 when you're 28, or whatever the age is, and then lump them all together. You have to have this pattern going back to adolescence, early adulthood that continued prior to the event. So if you have that, then that would be an appropriate diagnosis. But the second part of that is that doesn't give you the right to then eliminate.
Sustained. With regard to criminal cases you have been associated with, is it common for defendants to score high on anxiety in any test prior to a trial?
It's reasonably common if it's close by. It depends on how far away the trial is. But elevated versus clinically significant aren't always the same. If they're having a significant anxiety reaction, which would...
Sustained. Shouldn't you consider the possibility that the years spent in jail and the possibility of a death sentence or life imprisonment will show up in your tests as anxiety, stress, etc.? Why do you assume that these traits were caused by the events that occurred in 2008?
I'm not assuming anything. I don't know specifically what caused those results. That wasn't my role. I didn't evaluate her. I don't know what the other evidence that you've probably heard is. So I can't make that conclusion or decision. So I'm not assuming that. I'm telling you that these tests...
Sustained. When you evaluated these tests, did you know they were Jodi's or were they anonymous?
No, I knew they were Jodi's. I didn't know her or anything about it, but I knew it was from this case.
Had you heard of the case prior to evaluating the tests?
No.
Do you think what you knew of the case or Jodi could have affected how you interpreted the tests?
If I knew about the details of the case, there is the potential for bias, especially if there's a particular agenda I had. But as I said, when I was asked to be involved in this case, I was basically given tests. I really didn't know anything about it. I mean, it became very clear that she was on trial for murder, for killing her ex-boyfriend, but I didn't even know the details, and neither did my staff. That wasn't even part of what we were looking at. We were looking very specifically at the test, and then over time, we found out a little bit more, but I wouldn't even venture to say I know what's gone on in the last 4 or 5 months.
All right, are there any other questions? There appears to be another one in the basket. Counsel, please approach. Are there any other questions from the jurors? Looks like there is another one. Please approach. Some additional questions.
Yes, ma'am.
Do bullets always travel in a straight line when going through a human body, or is there the possibility that a bullet can change its trajectory by deflection?
Yes, if it hits something, it can.
If there is the possibility of change of trajectory, can you give us with 100% certainty what the exact path of the bullet was?
I could not.
You indicated that the act of leaving out the summary scales on the TSI did not indicate Dr. DeMarte had an inadequate understanding of the TSI, nor did you receive any materials that indicated this. Was there something else that left you with the impression that Dr. DeMarte had an inadequate understanding of the TSI or any of the other tests you reviewed? Please explain.
I was informed, because I didn't hear her testimony or know what she said. I was informed by the defense counsel that when asked about the summary scales, she did not know what they were or that they existed, and challenged the defense counsel on their existence or that there was such a thing. Not using it under an explanation is one thing. Not even knowing they exist.
Overruled. You may complete your answer.
Not using it or not knowing about it was of more concern to me. I mean, somebody can choose and say, okay, I'm not going to do this, and here's why. That wouldn't mean they at least know it and making an informed decision, so I then wouldn't have made such a comment. But also using it to try to then diagnose borderline and to ignore all the trauma symptoms is inappropriate. That suggests to me that this person is not really trained in either the issue of trauma or at least or the MMPI inventory. Similar with the MMPI, not using, not knowing about, or saying that all those supplemental scales we saw, content, are not supported by research or others is completely wrong. There are entire books that have been written over many, many years just on the MMPI by some of the psychologists and researchers who have been working on this their lifetime that shows all the research with all these scales. And so again, if you say, I'm not going to pay attention for this reason, that's one thing. Not knowing how it's to be used is really a problem. And it makes somebody else like me wonder, are you really trained and know how to really utilize these instruments?
Follow up, Ms. Wilmot.
You were asked questions, Dr. Geffner, about Dr. Samuels using the DSM-4 versus an updated version.
Oh, I didn't say, this is an older version. I assumed that meant DSM-3.
Oh, okay. Well, if Dr. Samuels actually used the DSM-4 instead of the TR, DSM-4-TR, is there a difference between the two that is going to cause a problem?
Not as much. I may have misunderstood. The DSM-3 definitely had major changes. The TR did have some minor changes. It's not as big a deal, but it's still, you should use the most current one.
Okay. And does the TR have any major changes with regard to the criteria of PTSD?
No, the TR version really didn't change the criteria for PTSD.
So if Dr. Samuels used the DSM-4 instead of the DSM-4-TR for PTSD, is there a problem with that?
No, not likely. I mean, I'd have to actually go back. It's been a while since I looked at DSM-4, but my recollection is that that didn't lead to any major changes in criterion or diagnosis.
All right. And with regard to the PDS test, if a person answers the PDS test as though there's a trauma, okay? So in other words, they're answering questions. Do you need to review something?
No, I'm
Okay.
just getting organized, sorry.
All right. So if a person answers questions with regard to the PDS test as though there is a trauma, okay, as though they suffered from a trauma.
Yes.
But it turns out that there is absolutely no trauma at all, okay? Is that a problem for you? Would that create validity problems with regard to the PDS test?
Well, it would create questions. If somebody is showing up with PTSD and there's no identified trauma, then the question is, what is going on? You know, why are they showing trauma symptoms? Did they have a trauma that they're not admitting to, a different event, or, you know, I mean, I don't have an answer for that, but that's the question I would need to answer in order to then dismiss that test. It's just unusual to say that there's no trauma anywhere, yet they show up with PTSD. That's harder to reconcile.
Okay. Then is that different than if somebody answers questions on the PDS test about a trauma and specifically listing that a trauma occurred with regard to being assaulted and having their life threatened? Does it matter to you if that assault occurred by a stranger or by someone they knew? Does that invalidate the test?
Yes, yes.
That was the question.
No, it matters because you want to be accurate, but it doesn't change then that whatever this person is referring to, whether it was a stranger or somebody they knew, caused this reaction. So the question would be to go back and find out, first, what is the event that actually occurred? Second is there a particular reason that person listed something else instead of what it was? But it wouldn't then, quote, invalidate the test. It would mean that whatever that person was referring to did cause this trauma, but we need to find out what that is.
Okay. And the results of the PDS test in this case, did she meet the criteria for PTSD?
Yes.
And is that consistent with the other tests that you reviewed with regard to the MMPI, the MCMI, and the TSI, two of them?
Yes, they were all consistent with an anxiety or trauma type of diagnosis or disorder.
Okay. You were asked questions about being able to manipulate tests. You remember that?
Yes.
And with regard to having, let's say, for example, these TSI tests, that there are two that are given by two different healthcare providers, right? Mental
Yes.
health people. And they're given a year and a half apart from one another. Is that right?
Yes.
And for their scales to be similar, to have similar elevations and similar results between the two TSI tests, what does that tell you about manipulating the tests or faking them?
Well, first thing is you look at the validity scales. If the validity scales were elevated and it meant it wasn't valid, then you would worry about faking or something. With them being valid and two similar profiles over that long a time period with two different examiners, it would lend quite a bit of support to that being an accurate portrayal of what's going on with the person. That'd be very hard to fake that the same way a year and a half later.
Okay, and with regard to when the TSI test given by Dr. DeMarte that we've discussed today, that particular test was referencing a certain time period, wasn't it?
Yes,
What was the time period that that test was referencing?
2007, 2008.
Okay. And is that before Ms. Arias was arrested even?
That's my understanding.
Okay. All of these tests, you'd agree, right, that we're in currently, what is it, May 1st of 2013, right?
Yes.
Okay. So all of these tests were conducted over, what, a 2-year period you told us before?
Yes, ma'am.
And what's that 2-year period?
2009 to 2011.
Okay. So the most recent test then was given at least 2 years ago? Or close to 2 years ago?
Well, a year and a half. That's bordering, getting close to 2 years, yes.
Okay. And the furthest test, the earliest test that was given is about 4 years ago, close to 4 years ago. Is that right?
Yes,
Okay. And is that before, long before we've started this trial, obviously, right?
that's my understanding.
Okay. And regardless of when these tests are given, is there a pattern of consistency between all the tests, starting in 2009 up to 2011?
Yes.
And that pattern of consistency tells you what?
Well, it makes it more likely that whatever it's saying is correct and accurate and should be dealt with or diagnosed or looked at in more detail. It goes back to the working hypothesis. It tends to have more support for that hypothesis.
If there's, when we talk about, you were asked questions about borderline personality and what Dr. DeMarte reviewed in her, or noted in her report.
Yes, ma'am.
Other factors. And you talked about needing a pattern of criteria that supports borderline prior to a traumatic event. Is that right?
In order to diagnose it separately.
Okay. And in the report that you reviewed from Dr. DeMarte, does some of the criteria that she uses to support her hypothesis or her diagnosis of borderline, is some of that criteria when Ms. Arias knew or was involved with Mr. Alexander?
Apparently based on what was reported by Dr. DeMarte.
And regardless of whether or not there's a diagnosis of borderline personality, you started to explain to us about that, something about you still can't exclude. Do you know what you were going to say?
Yes.
What is it that?
You can have the board.
Same objection.
Approach.
You may ask.
So what were you going to answer about you still can't exclude what?
I was going to say, you can't exclude the anxiety or PTSD. You can indicate and say that yes, it appears this person, based on records and everything else, has borderline personality. But unless you have particular reasons, that doesn't negate the PTSD trauma. So all the tests that still show that, you'd have to explain. So you can't say, oh, she has borderline personality or paranoid personality, so I'm forgetting all the other stuff. What would be more appropriate, if you believe that, is to have perhaps two diagnoses: borderline personality that preceded the event, and either post-traumatic stress or an anxiety disorder or something in addition. Or you'd have to really justify why all these consistent results are being ignored.
Okay. And you were asked a question about bullets and their path of travel. If it hits something, can it change direction because of deflection?
Yes.
Is this your particular specialty?
No.
Okay. But can you tell us, with your specialty, as far as your knowledge of what the different centers of the brain do, if in this case we have a bullet that is going in on the right-hand side just over the eyebrow and eventually being lodged into the left cheek, okay?
Yes.
And we know that the medical examiner said that it went through his sinuses, right?
Yes.
Based on that information, can you tell us where the bullet would have had to have traveled, maybe have been deflected, to make this person incapacitated?
It would have to somehow, well, two things. One is it would have to have been deflected through both the right and the left motor strips to incapacitate them. If there's any other thing, like couldn't speak, couldn't talk, and others, there'd be other areas of the brain. Whatever you're saying that the person could not do, then those are the areas of the brain that would need to have been impaired, damaged, or injured to then cause that kind of incapacitation or reaction.
And the motor strips are located more in the center of the brain?
Yeah, technically it's called frontal parietal. It's sort of in the center but inside also on both sides that I was showing on that diagram that we had up.
Okay, and if we were going to have an arrow pointing from where the bullet entered to where the bullet eventually was lodged, would that arrow in any way touch those motor sensory areas, those motor areas?
Not to my knowledge.
And this is all assuming that that Dr. Horn's medical examination report was incorrect when he stated that the dura mater was intact, right?
Yes.
If we were to assume that a bullet went through the brain, we'd have to also assume that Dr. Horn was incorrect and wrong when he said that the dura mater was intact.
It would have to have gone through it to get into the brain. If you're coming from the outside and you're getting to the inside, you've got to go through the stuff in the middle, which is the dura mater. So, yes, one of those two things aren't consistent.
All right, thank you. Nothing further.
Martinez.
Sir, one of the things that you told us was that there was a pattern of consistency between the tests, right?
Yes, sir.
Well, let's start with the PDS. Question 14 and the answer to number 4. You've been told over and over that that was a lie.
Objection misstates the testimony.
Overruled.
Okay? So we have the PDS that starts out with the lie. Then if we take a look at what we have here in the Elmo, which is 631, and you take a look over here at the validity scales, those are elevated, right?
One of them is, yes.
Well,
The F scale with the FBS are elevated, yes.
I'm asking about the validity scales. They are elevated, right? You're talking about the F scales. Aren't they elevated?
Yes, two of the scales are elevated.
And that means that there's an issue as to whether or not there's malingering there, right?
It's a caution you want to look
Sure,
at.
it can be the issue of secondary gain, right?
Yes, sir.
So if we're talking about somebody who now on 2 tests has already lied, the pattern is that this person is lying, isn't it?
Objection misstates his testimony.
Overruled. You may answer.
Isn't that what the pattern is?
No, because you just used the word lie. The lie scale is actually not one of the ones that was elevated. What was elevated was one that talks about either exaggerating symptoms or symptom severity. So
Sir.
that's different from lying.
So you're saying that somebody who do you go to the Alice Laviolette school that,
Objection argumentative.
Listing.
And move to strike.
Listing.
with regard to exaggeration, sir? So you're saying, for example, that if somebody exaggerates something, they're still telling the truth, right?
They might be, but it depends on how much they're exaggerating. That's a continuum.
So it's their degrees of exaggeration that determine, so when does the exaggeration become a lie for you? Is it 10%, 15%, 20%?
Objection beyond scope.
Overruled.
There is not a percent where it moves into one or the other that you can define the way you do. When you have something exaggerated, it means that there's other things you have to do to look at it, and you need to be cautious. But exaggeration doesn't mean it's either incorrect or a lie. It means this person is displaying many symptoms.
Didn't you just tell me that it depends on the exaggeration? The answer to my question. Isn't that what you told me?
That was the answer to the prior question, yes.
And so I'm asking you, what standard do you use to determine when an exaggeration, in your mind, becomes a lie?
They're not the same thing.
I'm not asking if they're the same thing, am I?
Well, yeah, you are. You're saying, when does an exaggeration become a lie?
Lie.
They're not the same thing.
I'm not asking if they're the same thing, am I?
Well, yeah, you are. You're saying, when does an exaggeration become a lie? Hard time answering
All
because
right,
they're different.
Let's do it by way of example. Let's say that the prosecutor tells you that he's 6 foot tall. Is that an exaggeration or is that a lie?
If we're talking about in this particular
This
case,
prosecutor here, right.
it would likely be both.
Oh, so then a lie can also be an exaggeration, right?
Objection relevant beyond scope.
Overruled.
It can be.
So when does it become a lie if we're talking about this prosecutor? What if he says he's 6'2"?
I don't know if there's a definitive cutoff that I would know about.
So what you're saying is anybody can exaggerate as much as they want, and to you, that never becomes a lie.
No, I did not say that at all.
Well, you're looking at the prosecutor. Do you believe that this prosecutor is 6 foot tall?
I don't believe so, no.
So if this prosecutor told you that he was 6 foot tall and said, I'm exaggerating, would that be the truth? Or would that be a lie, or would that be an exaggeration?
Objection relevant to the code.
Overruled.
If the prosecutor said he was 6 foot tall
Right,
and was
6'2".
6'2" and was exaggerating, what was then the question?
No, you indicated to me that that was an exaggeration. If this prosecutor told you he was 6'2", right?
It could be either.
And you said it could be either. When then, in your opinion, does it become, this exaggeration, become a lie?
I don't know if there's a specific cutoff that you could say like 5'8", 5'9". I wouldn't have a specific criteria that I would move from one to the other. I
Well,
think you have
we're
to
not-
look at the context.
You've now introduced something else. We're not talking about 5'8" or 5'9". I said 6'2". Do you remember that?
Yes, sir.
Objection just asked and answered beyond the scope.
Approach, please.
Of when an exaggeration becomes a lie. In this particular example that we have here, exhibit number 631, we have what we call the validity scale, right?
Yes, sir.
And there's an indication that there's an exaggeration as to 2 of those scales, right?
Potential.
Well, they are clinical, aren't they?
Yes, but as in-
Yes or no? Are they clinical?
Yes,
They are above the threshold, right?
they're above the clinical level.
Right, the clinical level, which is which is what? The little line that we have there, right?
Yes, sir.
What's the number for that line? 65?
Yes, sir.
And they are above that line, 2 of them, right?
Yes, sir.
So if you, in this case, you not only have 1, but you have 2 of the scales that are indicating that there's an exaggeration here, right?
No.
You only have 1 then that indicates an exaggeration?
No, they give you 3 possible indicators, which is what I tried to explain, but you cut me off. Those 2 don't just look at exaggeration. They give you 3 alternative possibilities when they're in the clinical level, one of which is exaggeration.
Right. And what you're choosing to do as you sit there on the witness stand is ignore the exaggeration and just look at the other 2, right?
No, sir.
Well, let's talk about the exaggeration. That's what I want. Would you agree with me that 2 of them could be exaggeration, right?
Yes.
And exaggeration is the same thing or akin to or is in the same neighborhood as a lie, right?
No, I actually think
So
I'm
the
going to
answer is
have...
no.
The answer would be no.
And is there ever a time where you would consider that an exaggeration, as we have on the MMPI, would be considered a lie? Ever?
I probably would not use the term lie with an elevation on the F scale. Would not be appropriate to use that term for that scale.
So the answer is never, correct? For
Yeah,
you?
correct.
Now, with regard to this PDS test that was administered, you're familiar with that, right?
Yes, sir.
What you told us was that, well, if somebody gave me a lie with regard to the event that triggered or that is being used sort of as the basis for the post-traumatic stress disorder, what you indicated that you would do is, rather than saying, wow, this person is lying to me, and they may be lying about their trauma, what you said is, the trauma is valid, I want to know why they lied, right?
No, that is not what I stated.
Could it then be the possibility that if they lied about the event that supposedly caused this trauma, that it could also be true that they lied about the symptoms, right?
Yes, could be true.
So if we have a PDS test that has those supposedly caused this trauma, that it could also be true that they lied about the symptoms, right?
Yes, could be true.
So if we have a PDS test that has those, consider it valid, right?
No, the valid is not the correct word to use
So
on that.
in this case, you've seen the PDS test, right?
Yes, sir.
Do you consider it valid, yes or no?
I can't answer that yes or no.
Well, why can't you answer it yes or no? You know, assuming the hypothetical, that the event involving two individuals is untrue. That's what we all know. She said that it wasn't true.
Well,
Assume that. No, assuming the hypothetical that the event involving two individuals is untrue. The answer? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm asking you to assume that the answer to question 14, when she marked number 4, was a total lie.
yes, sir.
Okay, assume that is the course of events in this case. Even with that, you're saying that this test is still valid, exhibit number 550.
No, I am not.
So then, if that's the case, if there was a lie as to that particular question, then it is something that would call into question the validity of this test, right?
You're using the word validity again, and it's not appropriate. It would call into question the results of the test, yes.
So it would call into question the results of this test that indicated post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
Correct.
And if it did that, and then we have the elevated scales here, that would further call this evaluation or this person, the validity of this MMPI. Wouldn't that also be called into question if you also have, as a precursor to that, an invalid result?
No, you just now confused two things. This profile that you just saw, or that we have up there, is not an invalid profile. In fact, when you run the computer scoring, it says it's a valid profile, and it tells you what cautions. So this being a valid profile with various cautions is separate from saying that that one is invalid, and therefore this is now invalid too. You're again mixing apples and oranges.
What you're saying then is that exhibit number 631
Yes.
is a valid result, right?
Yes.
It's a valid result with a concern that there may be an exaggeration.
Among other things.
So one of the other things that you also told us was that you were talking about the DSM-3. Do you remember being asked about that?
Just recently, yes.
Yeah, that DSM-3 came out 10 years ago, didn't it?
I think it was longer than that.
All right, how long ago did that come out?
Boy, I'd have to look. I thought it was in the 90s. DSM-3, I believe, was in the 90s. I don't actually remember. It's been so long.
It's a book that's probably no longer in print, right?
Probably not.
And now the book that people that are in this field use is DSM-4-TR, right?
Generally, yes.
And so with regard to one of the other tests that you talked about, the TSI, do you remember that?
Yes, sir.
The TSI, there was the TSI-1 and the TSI-2, right?
Yes, sir.
In this particular case, the TSI-1, when was it administered by Janine DeMarte?
Summer of 2011.
You have a month.
I can look if you want.
Please look.
It indicates on the test August of 2011.
All right, and when did the
March of 2011.
So February of 2011, right?
Yes, sir.
And the difference there is 6 months, right?
Approximately.
Wouldn't you agree that 6 months is a whole heck of a lot shorter period than 10 years?
Yes, sir.
And wouldn't you agree that in those 10 years, with regard to the other book that we're talking about,
Objection, Judge, may we approach?
Finish your question.
with regard to those 10 years, wouldn't you agree that there are changes in this book that was published at least 10 years before?
All right, thank you.
about the DSM-4? When was it published?
The 4TR was probably...
No, DSM-4, not TR.
In the 1990s, I don't remember the exact date.
When did the DSM-4 TR come out?
I believe it was around 2000 in that area,
So what we're talking about is a difference there about 10 years, right?
between DSM-3 and...
No, the DSM-4.
I don't think it was quite that long. I think DSM-4 was probably about somewhere around the mid-90s. It was probably at least 5 years. That's my recollection. I actually haven't looked at the date of the DSM-4 in a long time.
You're a psychologist, right?
Yes, sir.
And one of the Bibles, if you will, to diagnose somebody is the DSM, correct?
Yes, sir.
And so you are familiar with this book intimately, right?
Well, I wouldn't say intimately. Yes, I'm familiar with it.
And why wouldn't you be intimate with it? Isn't that the type of work that you do?
Well, no, we don't actually do a lot of diagnoses right now, but by intimate, that almost sounds like I have it memorized. I don't. I use it when I need to diagnose, and I know how to use the criteria, but I don't memorize it.
Do you know whether or not they're published about once every 10 years?
Well, the one that's coming out now is going to come out in 2013. That's going to be probably more like 12, 13 years from the last one.
And the last one was what? DSM-4 TR, right?
Yes, sir.
And before the DSM-4 TR was DSM-4, right?
Yes, sir.
So if we're talking about this space of time, DSM-4 TR, right?
Yes, sir.
And before the DSM-4 TR was DSM-4, right?
Yes, sir.
So if we're talking about this space of time from between the DSM-4 to the 2013, how many years would you say?
To really remember when the 4 came out. As I said, I don't really recall the copyright of the 4.
And there are changes to the book when it's sent out, right?
You mean published?
Published, right?
Yes, sir.
And so part of the reason that it's republished is because these changes are reflective of the ongoing research, for example, correct?
That would be one good reason, yes.
And that's the same reason for the TSI, right?
You mean the revision?
Right, the TSI 1 to the TSI 2, right?
Yes, sir.
And what you're saying is that if somebody gave the TSI 1, just because they gave the TSI 1 6 months before after the TSI 2 came out, are you saying that it's invalid?
No, I'm saying it's getting out of date, and the question is, why would you do it?
Pardon?
No, I said it's out of date, why would you use it? And that would be the question that I would ask if somebody was doing that.
You were asked about the materials reviewed by Janine DeMarte and about her borderline personality disorder. Are you familiar with the term personality disorder, NOS?
Yes.
That's borderline personality not otherwise specified, correct?
Yes.
That's in the family of borderline personality disorders, right?
Well, no, you got it backwards. You have it backwards.
How do I have it backwards?
Personality disorder, NOS, is a general personality
Right.
disorder. Borderline would be a subset of it. The personality disorder, NOS, would not be a subset of borderline, it'd be the other way around.
So in other words, what you're saying to me is that personality disorder is the umbrella, correct?
If you cannot determine a specific disorder, but you think that there is a personality disorder, but it doesn't specifically meet all the criteria, then sometimes that's a catch-all to say there is a personality disorder, but I can't really specify.
And all the way through this, we've been talking about all these tests, and you've been saying, well, there are characteristics of PTSD, right?
Yes.
Did you know that Dr. Samuels actually